All right, we'll go ahead and begin this morning. All right, we're going to be continuing our look at Leviticus, specifically the laws regarding ritual purity or ritual cleanliness. And I will say last week we started looking at these laws, and I had said, oh, this will be a two-part class last week and this week. I actually realized that there is an extra class that I didn't realize we had. And so, because of that, we're going to talk about Leviticus again today and then also next Sunday. So it'll give us a little more time to look into some of this, which I think is good because for a lot of us, this is a really a brand new topic or just something that we maybe only scratched the surface and haven't done a really deep dive into it. And so last week, we did have a crash course in ritual purity. It was describing what ritual purity is, but then in particular, ritual purity in Leviticus, because ritual purity was a concept in the ancient world, but of course, the way God uses it is much different than how the pagan nations used it. And so this class, this topic, admittedly, is very challenging. It is especially challenging if you weren't here last week and you missed the intro. So that is recorded, and I encourage you, if you're struggling with this, go back to the intro where we covered a lot of stuff. Yeah, you can't hear me? Is my mic not on? Oh, way to go! It's muted. There we go. How about now? Thank you, Julia. Good job. I heard me just fine. I don't know what. Okay. All right. So I don't know that I need to start over completely, but we're going to be covering the ritual purity laws in Leviticus. And as I just said, I didn't realize we had a class, one more class than I had planned for. So we're actually going to cover Leviticus last week, this week, and next week. And so we'll have one more class to get into this. And so I encourage you, if you weren't here last week, missed the crash course in ritual purity, so go back and look at that, because I think that'll be helpful going forward. Let's remember the context, right? So in Leviticus, Israel's come out of slavery. They have a lot of pagan mindsets because they've been surrounded by paganism, and they themselves worshipped other gods besides the Lord. So they don't understand the Lord very well. They don't understand His holiness. They think of Him in similar ways as the pagans thought of their gods. And so the Lord is giving them laws that teach about His holiness. And so multiple times throughout the law of Moses, but in particular in Leviticus, God says, I want you to be holy because I am holy. And of course, the word holy, as we've said before, means set apart, distinct from what is common. It is set apart. It is holy. And so that's what so many of these laws are. That's what all of these laws are addressing, but not just from a morality standpoint. Sure, there are laws that deal with holy morality, holy behavior. You're not allowed to murder. You're not allowed to steal. You need to value the life of another human being. You need to help the poor. That is all holy morality. But ritual holiness, laws involving rituals, are also part of these laws that God gave them. And those laws are reminders of holiness. Those ritual laws represent the concept of holiness, even if they're not necessarily addressing moral behavior. They're going to teach Israel about the concept of God's holiness. And so we talked about that last time, and we'll talk about that some more this time. Like we said last week, I mean, this is a very foreign concept to us. We don't live in a culture with a lot of rituals, and we certainly don't live in a culture that has ritual purity. And so because that's foreign to us, this is a little bit more of a challenging section of the Bible. So let's just do a quick recap. And what I want to do is just quickly cover, just summarize what we talked about last time. And then I want to pause and just answer any questions. Because I know when I first started studying this, because it was so new, because it was so unique, I just had tons of questions. And I want to make sure that if you have questions about what any of this means, or if there's anything that's confusing, that's going to be something that kind of prevents you from really grasping what we're talking about, that you have the opportunity to ask that. So let's just go back over that definition I gave last time of what ritual cleanness, ritual holiness is. And I'd said it's an imaginary way of perceiving and classifying people, places, and things loosely based on the idea of hygienic cleanliness. And so we had said God told them He wanted them to see things a certain way, to see things in categories, to see things as either unclean or clean or set apart as holy. And He gave them those specific criteria for how you would classify something. And we had said it's not about literal health or hygiene. There's not literally dirt on the unclean things, or the clean things aren't literally free of germs, whereas the clean things, well, they've got the unsanitary germs on them. It's not literal. That's just the imagery. That's the imagery behind this concept of being ritually clean, ceremonially clean. And so the laws do use words like clean and washing, purifying, defilement. That's the imagery. There's even sometimes ritual washings where they undergo washing, but not to get something literally off of them, but to put them in a ritually clean state so that now they are classified as clean as opposed to unclean, or an object is classified now as clean as opposed to unclean. And being unclean did not mean you had sinned. Now, sometimes you were ritually unclean and morally unclean because you had sinned, but often that's not the case at all. It didn't mean, oh, you definitely have sinned and you're guilty of something now and you need to seek forgiveness from God. Not necessarily. It just meant if you are ritually unclean, now you're in this category. And because you're in this category, there are rules, there are rituals for what you're supposed to do to honor that concept of unclean, and to honor that concept of then becoming clean, and to honor the concept of holiness. And so primarily that uncleanness is spread through touch, physical contact. The vast majority of the time, that's how uncleanness would spread. So if I am ritually unclean and I leave my jacket there and somebody else picks it up, they've touched my jacket, now they are ritually unclean. If I shake hands with someone who is unclean, now that has spread to me. And it's, once again, it's not about actual literal hygiene. I mean, I can touch something ritually unclean with this hand, and now all of me is unclean. So if this hand touches somebody, I've still spread it, even though, but wait a minute, it was just this hand that touched the unclean thing. It doesn't matter. It's not literally that we're passing on something, but they are to imagine that that is the case. They are to act like that is the case. And God was very serious about that. It wasn't just, hey, this is a nice thing to do. God was deadly serious about these laws and how they were to act in order to uphold this concept that what is holy should never come into contact with something unclean. And what is unclean has no place going toward into the presence, touching something that is holy. And so we said this last time, 4 major sources of uncleanness: dead bodies, whether it's a human or an animal; leprosy, which really is just a general term for a variety of different skin conditions that Leviticus lists out. Those visible major skin ailments would be something that now places you in that category of unclean. Sexual functions, we talked about that last time too. anything involving fluid loss in that regard. So even legitimate intimacy between husband and wife that places you in the state of unclean. Women in their menstruation, women after they've given birth to a child, men after they've experienced any sort of fluid loss at night while they're sleeping, and then sexual diseases, man or woman, if there's that fluid loss, then that now places you in that unclean state. And we talked last time about probably why God classified some of those things as unclean, as a way for him to make a distinction between how he is different in how he thinks of sexuality from the pagan nations and how they think of sexuality in regard to their pagan beliefs, what they think about their pagan gods, and the sexually immoral things that they have involved in their worship. God seems to be making a distinction there to make that clear. He is not like the pagan gods. And then certain meats are unclean. And so we talked about that last time, the different animals that are unclean. And all of this is because God dwells among them in the tabernacle. God is holy. His dwelling place is holy. And nothing unclean should come near it, should approach it, should come into contact with it. And so because of that, he has these rituals for them to better understand that concept of God being set apart. And I will acknowledge this too. I mean, a lot of this is the honor system, right? I mean, there's some of these things that, well, that would be unclean, but I'd be the only person that would know. And that's true. I mean, a lot of this is, if you're a faithful Israelite, you will recognize that you're unclean and you will take the proper actions, even though you could just ignore it and nobody would know. A lot of this is the honor system. A lot of this is very personal too. Much more personal, I think, than we're used to in our culture. But once again, just emphasizing what holiness is so that they understand it. When I say they had to undergo certain rituals if they were unclean and needed to go from an unclean state to a clean state, when I say rituals, those rituals often were the seclusion in your home or the separation from the camp, right? Both of those things keeping you from physically being able to approach the tabernacle in the middle of the camp. There was usually a specific period of time that you had to wait until that uncleanness could leave. And so often it was 7 days or something like that. And then also, in order to become clean again, one of the most common things that had to happen was cleansing through blood. And so, we think of blood as, oh, well, there's, that's actually a very dangerous thing, right? It's not sanitary. But if you think of it from a ritual cleanness perspective, blood cleanses things. And so often when you were unclean and you were moving to clean, it required a sacrifice. And we're used to thinking of, well, sacrifices were only to seek forgiveness, but that's not true. Yes, that was one of the primary things sacrifices were for, but many of their sacrifices were to purify themselves because of ritual uncleanness. And so the blood of those sacrifices would be a cleansing agent where now they are ceremonially clean. Or maybe some of the holy objects, like the altar in the tabernacle, maybe it has been defiled because of uncleanness, and so the animal blood is splashed upon it to cleanse the altar. So it's almost like there's this invisible unclean dust that is produced, that lands on things, lands on the altar or the tabernacle or on people. And so there needs to be the proper rituals to cleanse that. And so blood is used on the altar to cleanse the ritual impurity. Aside from blood, often oil is used. And not just any oil, there's a specific recipe for a type of oil they were supposed to make, And that holy oil is sprinkled or splashed on people or on things in order to cleanse it. And then water is used the same way. Often water is poured on someone, water is sprinkled on someone or something, and now it is ritually clean. And so all of this is part of what they did. It seems to us very bizarre. It seems to us just very convoluted and just extensive. But if you had grown up in this, if you had spent time studying this and learning this like the priest did, seeing this, witnessing this, it actually wasn't as complicated as it may seem to us. And that was part of their culture now. So to really sort of help us understand some of this, let me put up some charts just to show some of these different categories. You have the ritual state of unclean, then clean and holy. And so God's laws about dead bodies would be, well, you are in the state of unclean if you came into contact with a dead body. One of your relatives died and you had to bury them. An animal comes into the camp and dies, you got to move it. That would be in an unclean state. Somebody who hadn't come into contact with a dead body was clean. Or if they'd undergone the ritual afterward to become clean, then now they're in this clean state. But then you had holy priests who were told not to touch dead bodies ever. Even if it was a relative, they were not allowed to touch dead bodies. And so not only had the priests not come into contact with dead bodies, they had gone through the rituals to be moved into that holy state as a priest. And there were very extensive rituals for how a normal Israelite who is clean would then get moved into the holy state of being a holy priest. And so that's how the category of dead bodies relates to these ritual states. Similarly, skin conditions we talked about. If you had a serious skin condition, and it was the priests who identified that and labeled that, if you had a serious skin ailment, you were in the unclean state. Once again, didn't mean you'd sinned. That's just ritually, that's the category you were in. Somebody who is clean does not have any serious skin ailments. But then you had the holy priests who, they didn't have any serious skin ailments, and they had gone through the process of being set apart as holy priests. And so once again, these just different categories, they line up with these different ritual states. And we talked about this last time. Same thing with the food laws. Unclean animals couldn't be eaten. Clean animals could be eaten. And then from those clean animals, there were certain animals that were set apart and were designated as able to be used for sacrifice. So bulls and rams and goats, even for the poor, birds, certain birds were used as sacrifices if they couldn't afford a larger animal. And God made very clear this is why he put these food laws in place. Because he wanted the Israelites to understand that you have the rest of the nations. But God has separated Israel from the rest of the nations, and they are his people. And so they correspond to the concept of clean. And then from the Israelites, you have certain Israelites that now have been moved into the category of holy, and those are the priests. And this obviously, just at first glance, looks very politically incorrect to look at the nations and link them with the word unclean. But it's not because of their race. That was never something God said made somebody unclean. It's not because of their biology, anything like that. It's because they're pagans. And God was more than welcome throughout all of history for anyone from the nations to become an Israelite. They could join the Israelite nation. Many characters in the Old Testament that were Israelites weren't biologically descended from Abraham. They had been among the nations, but they had turned from the paganism and now served Yahweh and were now part of the Israelite nation. So they would be in the clean state. So it had nothing to do with literal race or biology. It was always if they are pagans engaging in pagan idolatry, they are not set apart like my people are. And so that's what God wanted Israel to understand. All of this, ritual purity, ritual cleanliness, ritual holiness being set apart, all of it was something God put into their laws to just permeate their culture, permeate their activity. And it would help us to imagine what that would be like. And so I've done this before. I've just sat by myself somewhere quiet and just tried to picture what would it be like if I was part of this culture where we honored the concept of set apart and we honored the concept of unclean things or people not coming into contact with holiness at the tabernacle. Imagining what it would have been like as an Israelite to have that as part of your culture. And when you do that, I think you really begin to appreciate how much you didn't appreciate holiness before you did that. There's been several times where I thought, if I had lived in this culture with these ritual states and these rituals in order to honor these different categories, it would have been a great foundation then for understanding moral holiness. And that is what God is doing here. Of course, He wants them to be holy in a moral sense, but these rituals are teaching that. Behind these ritual laws is the concept of moral holiness that God wants them to understand. That's what these ritual laws are instilling in them. That's what these ritual laws are teaching them. And we're all used to Jesus' teachings where He uses parables. That's what the Israelites are being. By following these ritual laws, they are a living parable of moral holiness. So just as a murderer has no business coming to the tabernacle and walking into the courtyard before the holy God, that is reprehensible, that holiness would be treated that way, the immorality of that. Israel reinforces that by they have rituals where I have a serious skin condition, and that is representative of sin. And so because of that, I back away and I seclude myself in my tent, or if the ritual requires, I am outside the camp in order to honor that concept. So they're a living parable of moral holiness. And I like the way that one of the authors I read put it. He said their entire life, their entire day-to-day life is an opportunity for them to exemplify this characteristic of God. And yes, it's required. God gave that to them as a requirement, not optional. But at the same time, you see so often in the Old Testament, faithful Israelites love this. They love being the embodiment of God's holiness by following His laws. All right. That's the summary of what we talked about last time. Any questions about any of that? I know a lot of that's new, or a lot of that may be confusing. Anything that makes you scratch your head and think, I don't get it, or what does this mean, or what about this situation? Anything like that at all? So either I did a fantastic job and there's not a single question among anyone, or it's so confusing that you're like, I'm not even sure what I could ask. There's too many things for my mind to try and comprehend. I will say, one time I was asked this. There was a lady in the class I was teaching that said when she was growing up, she had a serious skin condition as a little girl. And so this sort of bothered her, the idea that she would have to be outside the camp. And would she just, as a little girl, be by herself outside the camp? And so I had to remind her, no, it's not wrong to be in an unclean state necessarily. And so if she had a serious skin condition, never would she have been by herself, because who would have obviously come into contact with her? Her parents. And so it's not something where, oh, this child with this skin condition is sent out alone. Obviously, parents come into contact with their children. And so it would be something where the family would live together outside the camp. And that would be challenging for them, but that is a way for them to honor the idea that uncleanness must be distanced from the holy God. But it's not something, it just disturbed her to think that she possibly by herself would be sent away. And that's not at all the point of what Leviticus is trying to do. Yeah.
Did the Israelites have any problems with looking at unclean as something extremely negative? In other words, not just sickness with leprosy. Did they look at it as a negative condition on the person?
Yeah. So the question was, did the Israelites see somebody in an unclean state, probably related to like leprosy or a skin condition like that, and place a negative connotation on that person? That was never the purpose in Leviticus. That was never God's intention. But you do get the sense, especially in the New Testament, where it had reached a point where people did think, well, maybe this is a reflection on you and it's a punishment from God or something like that. So those attitudes probably did develop in the people that had chronic skin conditions. Everybody at some point becomes unclean. Everybody at some point has some sort of skin condition or comes into contact with a dead body. Or if you're married and you're having legitimate relations with your spouse, you'd be unclean for a short period of time. So it wouldn't have a negative connotation, those things, but something chronic where, wow, for long periods of time, or for those rare instances where somebody there most of their life or their entire life, they have this condition and are outside the camp. There probably is some pride in other people that developed in looking down on that person. Also because you had that belief that existed, that Job dealt with, and that even in Jesus' time was the case, that if you were sick, if you had a major health problem, you must have sinned. So you had that. So anybody that knew God's laws and looked at that would see that's not said. God's not saying that at all. But no doubt that would have come up sometimes, yeah. And we'll get to this next week. Jesus totally dispels that completely in the people he comes into contact with. Yes? Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. So the comment was, these people were not able to keep this law perfectly, which is why Christ came. And that's true. They could have if they were committed to it. But what you see so often in the Old Testament is, well, they just pretty quickly abandoned this. Or depending on who the king is, they may be following the law, or if the king doesn't care, the people don't care. And so they abandon the law so often. Also, and I think maybe this is related to what you're talking about too, some of this, if they were really trying to determine, have we addressed everything unclean in every way whatsoever? There's going to be times where, you know what, this guy didn't even realize it. He touched the coat of that guy that touched a dead body. And so now uncleanness actually got spread accidentally. Or maybe you have an Israelite that legitimately doesn't care and just doesn't go through the rituals, has a skin condition, but pulls his sleeve down and whatever, doesn't care. Touches people, goes close. You're going to have those times where, oh man, even the ritual laws aren't followed perfectly. We haven't talked about that, but that's what the Day of Atonement addresses. Once a year, the high priest goes inside the tabernacle into the most holy place sprinkles blood over the Ark of the Covenant and makes atonement through animal sacrifice and blood for all the sins, all the ritual and moral impurities, and that would cover then not those that are unrepentant, but any sort of accidental impurity that was spread, to where now Israel is back to a fully clean state. Yes? Oh yeah. Yeah. So yeah, the high priest going in, there's the story of a rope being around him and pulling him out in case he died in there. And so there was that fear, and a legitimate fear, that any priest that just failed to do what they were supposed to would be killed for it. But it's more than just that. It's the holiness of God is so set apart, it's actually deadly to those that are not holy. And so you have that idea of sin inside the tabernacle warrants death. And so there's that fear. Yes? Correct. Yeah. The question was if a priest is not supposed to touch a dead body, and let's say somebody dies in front of him and like he touches them accidentally or something, is he unclean? Yes. And so there was great effort made to prevent that from happening. But if that happened, now even the priest would be unclean and would have to go through the extensive ritual for returning back to a clean state so that then he could return back to the holy state. So probably that happened. But once again, the priests were very careful, at least when Israel was faithful. They were very careful to uphold that and be set apart from those things that were ritually unclean. Yeah. Any other questions? Yes. Oh yeah. Right. So again, another example where Aaron's sons, Nadab and Abihu, really just decided to transgress holiness, and they're going to offer something else. And so now they've gone against what God has said, and were killed for it. All right. So all of that, I think is going to help us better understand the rest of the Bible, because the rest of the Bible assumes that you already understand ritual cleanliness. The rest of the Bible just uses that. It just talks about that. And so I want us to look at some examples of that. Psalm 24, 3-4. Who shall ascend the hill of the Lord, and who shall stand in his holy place? He who has clean hands and a pure heart, who does not lift up his soul to what is false and does not swear deceitfully. So the psalmist here uses the idea of clean hands and a clean heart. And if you understand ritual cleanliness, then you understand how this is using that to make a point. Isaiah 59, your iniquities have made a separation between you and your God, and your sins have hidden his face from you so that he does not hear. For your hands are defiled with blood, and your fingers with iniquity. Once again, the idea of you understand ritual uncleanness, and now look at God saying to his people, your hands are defiled. All of you have unclean hands, defiled hands that have been defiled because of the sins you have committed. Isaiah 64, behold, you were angry and we sinned. In our sins we have been a long time, and shall we be saved? We have all become like one who is unclean, and all our righteous deeds are like a polluted garment. Now you could just say, oh, this is just talking about like actual dirt, and we're all just making the metaphor of, we're all like somebody who's fallen in the mud and our coat is covered in mud. But it's deeper than that, because if you understand ritual cleanness, what God is saying here is, or what Isaiah is saying on behalf of the people is, all of us are like a person who is unclean, or like a garment unclean, which means we cannot have access to God. We have to back away. We are separated from God. And so we are like a polluted garment that would be removed from God's presence. And then I want to show one more verse from Ezekiel where he really uses this concept. Ezekiel 36, 17 through 25. The word of the Lord came to me. When the house of Israel lived in their own land, they defiled it by their ways and their deeds. Their ways before me were like the uncleanness of a woman in her menstrual impurity. So I poured out my wrath upon them for the blood that they had shed in the land, for the idols with which they had defiled it. But I had concern for my holy name, which the house of Israel had profaned among the nations to which they came. And then later he says, I will take you from the nations and gather you from all the countries and bring you into your own land. I will sprinkle clean water on you, and you shall be clean from all your uncleanness, and from all your idols I will cleanse you. So what God is saying here is, the whole nation, because of their violence and the bloodshed they had committed, all of them are like a woman in her menstrual uncleanness. And so if you don't know Leviticus, you're going to think, whoa, like what a negative comparison to a woman, you know? But what he's saying is, a woman in her menstrual uncleanness is isolated inside her tent and cannot come out and come to offer sacrifice and come to appeal to the Lord. She has to wait. Just to wait until that's over. And so she's separated inside her tent. And what God is saying is all of Israel's like that. All of Israel. Because they've literally shed blood in violence and idol worship. All of Israel. It's like they're all just secluded inside their tents and nobody is fit to come before my presence. And so he's using that ritual impurity as a strong lesson for what their condition was. But then he says later on in chapter 36, I'm going to gather people from the nations. I'm going to gather people to me, and I will sprinkle clean water on you. You may think, what does that do? Well, if you know the ritual purity laws, you know that's what happened in many of these rituals. The priest would sprinkle clean water on the people, and now they are cleansed and can then approach God's presence at the tabernacle. And so when God says, I will clean you from your uncleanness, he's using that same imagery from Leviticus to address what he's going to do one day for the people that he brings from all the nations. We're going to stop there because I know we get a late start this morning. Next week, we're going to continue looking at some of the ways in which the scriptures use these concepts. And then we're going to address, okay, practically, how would we actually use this understanding of these rituals? How would we use what we've learned in our Christian walk today? Like, is it just something, oh, that's neat, there's a parallel, or is there actually a practical use that we could put into place with our understanding of these concepts? And there is. I want to talk about that next week. So I know a lot of what we said, once again, confusing, maybe even strange to us in our culture. If you have any questions or want to talk about anything, I'm more than happy to. So thank you very much. I appreciate it.